Marvel's Black Widow is here. It is a movie that many a fan have wanted for more than a decade. But now that it's here, quite a lot of people don't want it anymore, nor the direction it promises to take the MCU in. How badly did Disney have to mess up for that to happen? We shall see, for in this editorial, I will begin by briefly going through Black Widow's origins in the comics and her long march to the big screen, before exploring how this movie soldiers a new direction for the MCU, a direction not everyone necessarily wants. Natasha Romanova, the Russian super spy better known as Black Widow, made her first appearance in Tales of Suspense issue 52 back in March of 1964 during the height of the Cold War. Originally conceived as an antagonist for Iron Man, Black Widow would eventually defect to the United States and become an Avenger. When the comic book movie boom took off back in the early 2000s, she was one of those considered for a movie adaptation. In the spring of 2004, Lionsgate announced they were developing a Black Widow movie, to be written and directed by X2 screenwriter and Metal Gear Solid voice actor David Hayter, although clearly nothing came of it. A decade later, he told CBR why not. Unfortunately, as I was coming up on the final draft, a number of female vigilante movies came out. We had Tomb Raider and Kill Bill, which were the ones that worked, but then we had Blood Rain and Ultraviolet and Aeon Flux. Aeon Flux didn't open well, and 3 days after it opened, the studio said, "We don't think it's time to do this movie." At this time then, the window for a Black Widow movie maybe had not yet opened, but times were changing. In January 2009, Emily Blunt entered talks with Marvel to portray Black Widow in Iron Man 2, meaning the job was hers. A multi-picture deal and the role of a lifetime which would have made her career, had it not been for the fact that she already had a multi-picture deal with Fox. And they exercised an option so that she had to drop out of Black Widow in order to appear in Jack Black's Gulliver's Travels instead. Marvel then went with their runner-up choice of Scarlett Johansson, who would portray the renamed Natasha Romanoff in the multi-picture deal meant for Blunt. Iron Man 2 was released in the summer of 2010 and was met with mixed reviews. Nevertheless, Johansson's Black Widow was warmly received by Marvel fans. She would go on to appear in many more MCU titles, each of which would further cement her status as a fan favorite and make Scarlett Johansson a superstar. Fans wanted a Black Widow solo movie. They would not get one until it was arguably too late. Black Widow died in 2019's Avengers Endgame. So when Variety broke the scoop that the Black Widow solo movie had a writer attached in January 2018, the train in many ways had already left the station, and everyone involved already knew the character was dead. They were doing a prequel. 2 months later, The Hollywood Reporter revealed that as part of a diversity push in the broader film industry, Marvel Studios were explicitly looking for a female director to helm the movie. They found one in Australian director Kate Shortland, who was tasked with giving the character a proper cinematic send-off and using her standalone film as a theatrical launching pad for Phase 4. However, the lockdowns intended to curb a certain beer bug threw a wrench into those plans. Initially slated for May 1st of 2020, Black Widow was pushed back 3 times. First to November 6th of 2020, then to May 7th of 2021, and finally to July 9th of 2021, the day that would stick. After much back and forth, Disney eventually decided that the movie would be released simultaneously in theaters and on Disney Plus Premier Access. While still the first Phase 4 theatrical movie, Black Widow was now the fourth Phase 4 installment, following in the footsteps of the Disney Plus Phase 4 series WandaVision, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and Loki. None of these series knocked it out of the park. Each and every one of them has been accused of being overtly long, overtly slow-paced, and ultimately overtly unimportant in their own right, beyond setting up what comes next. In order to combat any kind of residual disappointment or burnout from these, Black Widow would have needed an incredibly fun marketing and press campaign, promising all audiences the good time they have come to expect of the Marvel brand after almost a decade and a half of crowd pleasers. I stressed would have needed in the past never tense, because that's not the kind of marketing the movie got. And that sense of fun is no longer what the MCU represents. In a June interview with Collider, Scarlett Johansson discussed, or rather distanced herself from the sexualization of Black Widow in earlier MCU films like Iron Man 2. She said, "You look back at Iron Man 2, and while it was really fun and had a lot of great moments in it, the character is so sexualized, you know? Really talked about like she's a piece of something, like a possession or a thing or whatever. Like a piece of ass, really." Johansson went on to argue that the world has changed considerably since 2010. But here I'd like to interject that these changes are mostly in LA and Hollywood. They're not nearly as pronounced in the rest of the world. But as a result of changes in what Hollywood considers to be the world, the entertainment industry now places a much heavier emphasis on female empowerment and the self-worth of young girls. Scarlett Johansson and co-star Florence Pugh, who the movie sets up as the new Black Widow replacement going forward, doubled down in an interview with Glamour magazine.
We are undermined and underserved and underappreciated and underpaid, and you have to be your own ally. My mom instilled that in me from when I was really, really young, because of course she'd experienced it even more severely than I did. And equal pay is a huge part of that fight. When I was a teenager in the industry, or a young woman, I should say, my mom, would have those conversations like, why is she not getting, it had never had anything to do, there was always these little key terms like, bankability and, box office draw. And those are all terms that are basically masquerading as sexism. It never had anything to do with those things. And if there ever was, it was also part of the systemic issue that, a woman could not be as bankable or have a same box office draw. It was.
Scarlett Johansson is struggling with forming sentences here, because this probably doesn't come from the highest paid actress in Hollywood, who earns more than most of her male co-stars. These talking points were prepared for her as part of the movie's marketing campaign. In a July 2nd paid-for puff piece in Time magazine titled "Black Widow Begun as a Sexist Stereotype," more than a decade later, Scarlett Johansson is reclaiming her story. Marvel head honcho Victoria Alonso expressed the exact same sentiment, only she went even further, criticizing almost every male MCU character and MCU movie up till this point for, in not so many words, being misogynist and having held back Scarlett Johansson and Black Widow. That Alonso herself was there and allowed it to happen is kind of glossed over, of course. But now things will change. Marvel will do better. I won't go through the entire article here, but it's nicely summed up by its conclusion. Johansson's first and presumably last solo outing as Black Widow feels like a bittersweet tribute to the character that broke ground for the many women Marvel now spotlights. It also marks a new chapter for one of the most successful movie studios. one in which women, at long last, will redefine blockbusters for millions around the world. Part of this redefining is taking men to task, which is evident from the Black Widow movie itself. I won't go into any spoilers in this video, so let's stick with the reviews which are already out there in the ether, as some of them have become de facto parts of the movie's marketing campaign. In many respects, film criticism has become indistinguishable from film marketing. And while this unholy hybrid of criticism and promotion was much less in your face for Black Widow than it was for Captain Marvel, it was nonetheless noticeable. In this regard, IndieWire is on the front lines, and their Black Widow review contained gems like: needless to say, the movie does a far better job than the inclusivity gesture at the end of Endgame to play up its feminist leanings. Black Widow not only passes the Bechdel test, it forces men to squirm as it puts them in their place. The MCU is the biggest entertainment franchise of all time, with each movie in it on average grossing more than $1 billion. They did that because audiences around the world spent a decade learning that going to an MCU movie meant having a good time in the theater. In marketing Black Widow, however, all of those movies that actually built the MCU to what it is today have been thrown under the bus as being rife with misogyny. The movies that audiences fell in love with are all problematic now. But don't worry. Phase 4 changes all of that, as we've already seen in the Disney Plus series. In fact, we've also seen it in Birds of Prey, Charlie's Angels, and Terminator Dark Fate. However, none of those movies performed all that well at the box office, so that's actually a bad sign for Black Widow. Luckily for Marvel though, even if Black Widow should disappoint, they've got both the Eternals and Shang-Chi lined up for release soon. We shall see for how long audiences will continue to flock to the MCU in the numbers they did before. Let me know your thoughts on all of this, and how excited you are for Black Widow and the new direction it heralds, in the comments.